Shadowbrook Estate, the Dark Mansion. I had heard about Shadowbrook Estate long before I decided to set foot inside. A grand mansion left abandoned, nestled deep within the dark pine forests of Ontario, Canada. The estate once belonged to the wealthy Winslow family, but on a winter night in 1978, the entire family vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty house with an unfinished feast still laid out on the dining table. When my friends, Ryan, Lisa, Mark, and I arrived, the atmosphere alone sent shivers down our spines. Despite the afternoon sun, the shadows from the surrounding forest seemed to smother the mansion in a perpetual dusk. The rusted iron gates stood ajar, almost as if they were inviting us in. Lisa clutched her camera tightly, whispering, "I have a bad feeling about this place." Ryan scoffed, trying to appear fearless. "Come on, it's just an old house." We stepped through the gates, cautiously making our way across the vast courtyard covered in dead leaves. The three-story mansion loomed before us, its shattered windows staring down like empty, soulless eyes. A gust of wind swept through the darkened corridors, carrying with it the faint scent of something that smelled like burnt candles. Mark pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and they groaned loudly, as if mourning. Inside, a grand foyer stretched before us, coated in dust and decay. A magnificent crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its candles intact, untouched by time. I stepped inside, feeling the air grow thick around me. Lisa panned her camera around the room, the flashlight flickering sporadically. "Do you guys hear that?" she suddenly asked. I listened. At first, there was only silence, but then, a faint melody drifted through the air, the slow, melancholic tune of a piano being played somewhere within the mansion. "Is someone else here?" Mark whispered, his voice laced with unease. We decided to venture deeper into the house. Down a long corridor, old portraits lined the walls, all depicting the Winslow family. But what unsettled us most was how their eyes seemed to follow our every move. Suddenly, the chandelier behind us swayed violently. A soft giggle echoed through the empty hall. Lisa spun around, camera in hand, but there was nothing there. "We should leave," she urged. But Ryan, ever the daredevil, walked toward the grand dining hall. The wooden doors creaked open on their own, revealing a sight that froze us in place. Inside, a long dining table was perfectly set, silver plates gleamed. Crystal glasses sparkled under an unknown light. But the most disturbing thing was the food. It looked fresh, as if the dinner had been prepared just moments ago. Despite the house being abandoned for over 40 years, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the room, and the candles on the table all ignited at once. My breath hitched, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. Lisa trembled, stepping back, but at that moment, she let out a blood-curdling scream. At the head of the table, where there should have been an empty seat, a woman in a black evening gown was now sitting. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes sunken into dark voids, and as she slowly turned to face us, I realized she had no eyes at all. Mark swung his flashlight toward the apparition, but in an instant, she vanished. However, the sound that followed sent ice coursing through my veins, the scraping of a chair being pushed back, as if someone had just stood up. Without a second thought, We bolted out of the dining hall, hearts pounding. But when we reached the grand foyer, we were met with something even more terrifying. The front doors were gone. In their place was a solid brick wall. Lisa gasped, "No, this isn't possible. Where's the door?" A soft chuckle floated down from the second-floor balcony. I looked up and saw him, a man in a black suit. His face smeared as if it were a blurred painting. "We're trapped," Mark whispered, his voice trembling, and as if in response, all the doors within the mansion swung open simultaneously, beckoning us deeper into the nightmare. The mansion's doors had all flung open at once, as if some unseen force was inviting us deeper inside. My chest tightened, and though every instinct screamed at me to run, I knew there was nowhere to go. "What do we do now?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling as she gripped the camera tightly. Ryan glanced around, his face darkening as he looked toward the staircase. "We go up," he said. "If there's no way out down here, maybe there's something upstairs." Mark immediately protested. "Are you insane? You want to go up there and face whatever that thing was on the balcony?" But despite our fear, we all knew there was no other choice. Taking a deep breath, I led the way, each step up the decaying wooden staircase echoing through the empty halls. Portraits of the Winslow family lined the walls along the corridor, their painted eyes following us with eerie precision. Something was different now. The expressions in the paintings had changed. The once stoic faces now seemed amused, as if they were entertained by our predicament. At the end of the hallway, a door creaked open. Inside, a grand bedroom awaited, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering chandelier. A four-poster bed stood at the center, its sheer white canopy drifting as if caught in an unseen breeze. But what made my blood run cold was the shadowy figure sitting just behind the curtain. "Is someone there?" I forced out, my voice barely above a whisper. The curtain slowly dropped, revealing a woman in a long black dress. Her milky white eyes held no pupils, her lips moving silently as if speaking a language we couldn't hear. Then, a whisper, cold and disembodied, echoed throughout the room. "You came just in time. The feast is about to begin." Lisa screamed and turned to flee, but as we spun around, the door slammed shut behind us. The woman rose from the bed, her feet hovering inches above the floor, her skeletal hand stretching toward us. A corpse lay at my feet, one that hadn't been there moments ago. Its face was frozen in terror, mouth open in a silent scream. The room grew unbearably cold, and suddenly, shadows began creeping from the corners, slithering along the floor like living tendrils of darkness. Ryan lunged for the door, yanking at the handle. "It won't budge." Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "We're going to die here." A chilling laughter filled the room. The woman's body lifted higher, her tangled hair swirling around her as if caught in a whirlwind. Her hollow gaze bore into me, and I suddenly felt an invisible force tighten around my throat. I gasped, clawing at my neck as the air was squeezed from my lungs. Lisa screamed as something unseen yanked her backward, her body dragging across the floor, her nails scratched against the wooden planks, leaving behind deep grooves. "Help me," she shrieked, her voice raw with terror. Ryan lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling with all his strength. For a moment, it seemed like the darkness wouldn't let go. But with a final desperate yank, Lisa tumbled into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The shadows that had wrapped around her dissipated, retreating back into the corners of the room like wounded beasts. The woman in black screeched, her voice inhuman, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. The walls of the mansion trembled, the chandelier above us shaking violently. Cracks formed along the ceiling, dust raining down upon us as the entire room seemed to twist and warp around us. Just as darkness threatened to consume me, everything stopped. The woman was gone. The room was eerily still. A small door in the corner, which hadn't been there before, creaked open. "Go, now," Mark shouted. We didn't hesitate. We ran through the doorway and found ourselves back in the grand foyer. The front door, which had vanished earlier, was back, wide open, as if the house had decided to let us go. Without looking back, we sprinted across the courtyard and dove into our car, hearts pounding. The mansion stood silent and still behind us, as if nothing had ever happened. But just before we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. In one of the second-floor windows, she stood there, the woman in the black dress, her pupil-less eyes locked onto mine. And then, she smiled. As we sped away, Lisa whimpered, "We should never have come here." The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I searched online for any records of Shadowbrook Estate. What I found sent a chill down my spine. The Winslow family had vanished in 1978. Yes, but a team of paranormal investigators had entered the mansion in 1993. They never came out. Their names? Lisa, Ryan, Mark, and me. The end. Blackwood House, the cursed cabin. I had always been drawn to places with dark histories, but nothing could have prepared me for Blackwood House. The rustic log cabin stood deep within the dense forests of Louisiana, its wooden walls warped with age and its windows shattered by time and neglect. The house had been abandoned for decades, yet rumors of eerie happenings and unexplained disappearances still loomed over it like a deathly fog. It was Ryan's idea to spend the night there. "Come on, James," he had said, grinning. "You write about haunted places all the time. What better way to get inspiration than to experience one firsthand?" His enthusiasm was infectious, though I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my bones. Still, I agreed. By the time we reached the house, dusk was already settling in, casting long shadows between the towering pines. The cabin stood ominously, its front door slightly ajar, as if waiting for us. Lisa, our resident skeptic, scoffed, "It's just an old house. No ghosts, no curses. Let's just get this over with." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The wooden floor creaked under our weight as we stepped cautiously into the main living area. An old stone fireplace stood in the center, its bricks blackened with soot. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden beams overhead, their meaning lost to time. "What do you think these mean?" I asked, running my fingers over the carvings. Mark, our self-proclaimed expert on folklore, adjusted his glasses and frowned. "Protection symbols, maybe, or warnings. Depends on who carved them." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Or maybe just some teenagers messing around. Come on, let's set up camp." We unrolled our sleeping bags and placed lanterns in each corner of the room, casting flickering light onto the walls. It was then that we noticed the odd sensation. The house seemed heavier, as if the air itself pressed down on us. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut, making Lisa jump. "Relax," Ryan laughed. "It's just the wind." But I wasn't so sure. Something about this place felt wrong. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest outside grew distant, replaced by an unnatural silence. Even the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves seemed to vanish. The fire in the fireplace flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, just a murmur in the background, like the wind pushing through the trees. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder. Words we couldn't understand echoed through the room, hushed yet urgent, like unseen voices arguing just beyond our perception. Lisa clutched her flashlight, her face pale. "Did you hear that? It's just the wind," Ryan insisted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Then, we heard the knock, a single, deliberate knock on the front door, followed by another, and another. Lisa gasped. Who would be out here at this hour? Ryan, ever the brave one, stood up and walked toward the door. Probably some hiker messing with us. I wasn't so sure. "Ryan, don't," but he had already swung the door open. Nothing, just the empty, moonlit forest stretching endlessly beyond the porch. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt charged, like the sky before a thunderstorm. "See? Nothing," Ryan said, turning back with a grin. Then, the door slammed shut on its own. The lanterns flickered violently. The whispering turned into hissing. Shadows began to shift unnaturally along the walls, moving against the flickering firelight. A guttural growl rumbled from somewhere deep within the house. Lisa screamed as a handprint, dark and wet, appeared on the window beside her. "We need to go now," Mark shouted, but as we scrambled to grab our bags, the cabin seemed to come alive. The wooden walls groaned, the cymbals overhead seemed to pulse, and from the hallway beyond, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, began to approach. The air turned frigid. My breath came out in visible puffs as I turned toward the hallway. The shadows at the far end of the corridor twisted and convulsed, forming something vaguely human. Then, I saw them, two glowing eyes, watching us from the darkness. We were not alone. The cabin trembled around us as the oppressive air thickened, pressing against our chests like a suffocating force. The whispering had turned into distorted, unintelligible voices that rose and fell in a chorus of anguish. Lisa clung to my arm, her breath shallow, while Mark frantically fumbled for his flashlight. The flickering lanterns barely pushed back the growing darkness, as if the house itself was swallowing the light. Then, the footsteps resumed, slow, deliberate, echoing down the corridor toward us. The glowing eyes in the darkness never wavered, locked onto us like a predator stalking its prey. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Ryan, ever the skeptic, took a cautious step forward. "Who's there? Show yourself." A low growl reverberated through the walls, a sound so guttural and unnatural that it made my stomach churn. Then, the thing moved. It didn't walk, it glided. its shadowy form stretching unnaturally along the corridor walls as if it were bleeding into the wood itself. As it drew closer, its eyes burned brighter, and the lanterns flickered more erratically. A putrid scent filled the air, a mix of rotting wood and decayed flesh. Lisa let out a choked sob. "We need to leave." Mark backed up against the fireplace, eyes darting toward the door. "The symbols," he gasped, pointing at the strange carvings above us. "They were meant to keep it out. But we're inside now. We broke the seal." My stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" "It means..." Mark's voice trailed off, his face pale. "We let it in." Before we could react, the creature lunged. The room erupted into chaos as the shadows expanded, stretching out like grasping hands. Ryan was yanked backward by an unseen force. His scream cut short as he disappeared into the darkness of the corridor. Lisa shrieked, gripping my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. "We have to get out." I grabbed a lantern and swung it toward the advancing shadows, the flames casting grotesque shapes against the walls. The creature recoiled for a split second, its form shifting and distorting, as if writhing in pain. It wasn't enough. Mark scrambled toward the entrance, fumbling to unlock the front door. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. Lisa and I rushed toward him just as Ryan's scream rang out again, this time from the ceiling. We looked up in horror to see him suspended in midair, his limbs jerking violently as if invisible strings controlled him. His mouth gaped open in a silent cry, his eyes wide with terror. "Help him," Lisa sobbed, but I knew it was too late. The entity dragged Ryan up into the darkness, and with a sickening snap, his body vanished. The cabin shuddered violently as the lanterns exploded, plunging us into near total darkness. "Go," I shouted. Mark finally forced the door open, and we tumbled out into the freezing night. The moment our feet hit the ground, the house let out a deafening groan, as if it were alive and enraged. The doorway behind us slammed shut, the windows shattering outward as a powerful gust of wind howled through the trees. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took 3 tries before the engine roared to life. The moment the headlights illuminated the cabin, my blood ran cold. The creature stood at the window, watching us. Its burning eyes were the last thing we saw before we sped down the dirt road, leaving Blackwood House behind. None of us spoke on the way back to town. Lisa sobbed quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. Mark stared blankly ahead, his mind lost in shock. I could still hear Ryan's scream echoing in my ears. Days later, we returned with the police. The house was still standing, eerily silent and untouched. No signs of forced entry. No blood. No Ryan. According to town records, Blackwood House had been abandoned for over a century. No previous owners. No records of any Ryan ever existing. But I remember him, and I know the house does too. Villa della Nebbia, the mansion of mist. It was a place few dared to speak of. A mansion that existed within the swirling embrace of an eternal fog. Villa della Nebbia, once a symbol of grandeur in the Italian countryside, had long since become a ruin swallowed by time and superstition. Legends whispered of guests who had entered but never returned, of spectral figures that wandered its endless halls, and of a presence lurking in the mist that surrounded the estate like a living thing. I had always dismissed such stories as fabrications of overactive imaginations. That is, until I found myself standing before the wrought iron gates of the infamous villa. The heavy air thick with dampness, the fog curling around me as though trying to whisper secrets in my ear. My name is Daniel Hayes, an American travel writer with a penchant for the paranormal. I had spent years documenting supposedly haunted locations, debunking myths with a scientific approach. Villa della Nebbia was my next target, a challenge I eagerly accepted. Alongside me were my two colleagues, Sophia, a historian well-versed in Italian folklore, and Marco, a local guide who had grown up hearing the chilling tales of this cursed estate. "This place is not safe," Marco muttered, shifting uneasily. His dark eyes scanned the fog as if expecting something to emerge from it. "People go missing here. The ones who return are different." Sophia adjusted her glasses and scoffed. "There is always a logical explanation. These stories have been exaggerated over time." I smirked. "That's what we're here to find out." With that, I pushed the gates open, the rusted metal groaning in protest. A cold gust of wind slipped past us, carrying the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic, blood. Perhaps, the sensation made my skin crawl, but I shook it off. We pressed forward through the mist, each step making the world beyond the gates seem more distant, as if reality itself was fading behind us. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade cracked and weathered, ivy clinging to its walls like veins feeding a decayed corpse. Massive windows, once filled with light and laughter, were now shattered, their jagged edges resembling hungry teeth. Yet, despite its abandonment, there was an undeniable energy to the place, an awareness that prickled against my senses. Marco hesitated at the threshold. "If we go inside, we do not split up. And if something feels wrong, we leave immediately." I nodded, agreed. The grand doors creaked open with surprising ease, revealing a vast foyer covered in a thick layer of dust. Chandeliers hung overhead, their crystals dulled by grime, yet a few still swayed slightly as if disturbed by an unseen force. The air was stale, carrying the scent of forgotten memories and something more, something rotten. A grand staircase spiraled upwards, its mahogany railing chipped but still sturdy. Sophia ran her fingers along the wood, examining the intricate carvings. "These designs are from the 17th century. Remarkable craftsmanship." Marco ignored her fascination. "We should check the main hall first. That's where most of the disappearances were reported." I agreed and led the way, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The deeper we ventured, the heavier the silence became. It was not the silence of an empty house, but rather the hushed anticipation of something waiting to be acknowledged. Then, we heard it, a whisper, low, unintelligible, yet filled with urgency. Sophia froze. "Did you hear that?" Before we could respond, the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices spilling through the corridors. The chandeliers above flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. The air turned frigid. Marco grabbed my arm. We should go. But before we could retreat, the heavy wooden doors behind us slammed shut with a deafening finality. A woman's laughter echoed through the halls, distant yet somehow right beside us. The air rippled, and the mist outside pressed against the windows as if alive. And then, from the darkness beyond the hall, footsteps approached. We were no longer alone. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, echoing down the corridors with an unsettling rhythm. My breath caught in my throat as I turned towards the sound. The mist outside thickened, pressing against the shattered windows as if desperate to seep inside. Marco whispered hoarsely, "We need to leave, now." But the doors behind us had shut, the heavy wood refusing to budge no matter how hard he pushed. Sophia trembled, clutching her notepad like a lifeline. "This doesn't make sense. This isn't real." Another step, then another. From the gloom of the grand hall, a figure emerged, a woman, draped in a gown that shimmered unnaturally, her body moving with an eerie fluidity, like mist given form. Her face was obscured, her features blurred as though time itself had erased her. But her eyes, those hollow, endless voids, were fixed on us. A cold whisper slithered into my ears, not from her lips but from the very air around us. "You should not have come." Sophia let out a strangled cry. Marco yanked at the door again. But the house seemed to be holding us captive. The chandeliers above rattled, flickering violently, and the carvings along the walls, once intricate designs of Italian craftsmanship, now writhed, twisting into grotesque faces contorted in silent screams. The woman took another step forward. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an overturned chair. My mind raced. The legend spoke of guests who vanished, of spirits trapped within these walls. What if we had already crossed into their world? The whispers turned into wails. Doors along the corridor burst open one by one, revealing rooms filled with shadowy figures. Faces indistinct but their agony unmistakable. They reached out, their hands stretching unnaturally toward us. "We're trapped," Sophia whimpered. "This is their domain now." Marco, always the rational one, clenched his fists. "No, there has to be a way out." But even as he spoke, the house seemed to shift. The walls elongated, the doors stretched farther away, twisting into an impossible maze. The villa was alive, reshaping itself like a nightmare that had no end. Then I saw it. The grand mirror at the far end of the hall. Unlike the rest of the house, it remained untouched, its glass surface pristine. And within it, I saw something impossible, our reflections. But they were not moving in sync with us. They were beckoning. I grabbed Sophia's hand, dragging her toward it, the mirror. "Maybe it's a way out." Marco hesitated, then followed as the mist woman let out a wretched, piercing shriek. The figures in the rooms surged forward, their forms dissolving into shadows as they reached for us. With a final desperate leap, we crashed into the mirror, everything inverted. For a fleeting moment, it felt like being swallowed by ice, an abyss of endless silence. Then we were falling, no, tumbling, until suddenly, we were back outside. The villa stood before us, silent once more, the mist beginning to dissipate. The doors were wide open, as if they had never been locked at all. Panting, I turned to Marco and Sophia. Their faces were pale, their eyes filled with the same unspoken question. Had it all been real? Sophia glanced down at her notepad, then gasped. The last page had been filled with words she did not remember writing. "You have been marked. The villa will call you back." A chill ran down my spine as I looked back at the house. For a moment, just before the fog swallowed it again, I saw her standing there, waiting. Then, as if the house had not yet released its grip on us, a gust of wind howled through the trees, carrying a faint whisper that wrapped around my mind like a ghostly caress. "We are not done." The three of us stood in stunned silence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. "Let's go," Marco finally said, his voice hoarse. We walked back to the car in silence, none of us daring to look back again. But as I slid into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of the villa in the rearview mirror. It stood shrouded in mist, still and silent. Then, for just a fraction of a second, I saw something impossible. Our own reflections staring back at us from within the fog, their eyes hollow and waiting. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering before roaring to life. The drive back to the village was silent, the weight of the night pressing against us. When we arrived, we didn't speak of what had happened. We couldn't. But that night, I dreamed of the villa. I dreamed of standing before its gates once more, unable to move, unable to resist the pull of the fog that slowly wrapped itself around me. And in the distance, from inside the house, I heard laughter, soft, inviting, calling me home. The glass house, the haunted reflection. The glass house stood as an anomaly in the dense urban sprawl of Tokyo. Unlike the traditional wooden homes of the surrounding neighborhood, it was a marvel of modern architecture, constructed entirely of glass. With sleek, steel beams and an open, minimalist interior. Yet, for all its beauty, no one had lived there for more than a few weeks before leaving in a frantic hurry. Some abandoned furniture, others left food rotting on the kitchen counter. The stories varied, but they all shared one common thread: something inside the house was watching. I had spent years investigating paranormal phenomena across Japan, from the abandoned tunnels of Aokigahara to the spectral ruins of Gunkanjima. But the glass house was different. It was not an ancient shrine or a forsaken battlefield. It was a place of the present, modern, pristine, yet undeniably cursed. I arrived at the house just before dusk, accompanied by my colleague, Naomi, a journalist obsessed with uncovering the truth behind haunted locations, and Satoshi, a local guide with an unshakable skepticism. We had managed to secure a night inside the house through an elusive real estate agent, who handed us the keys with little more than a cryptic warning: "Don't look too long into the glass at night." As we stepped inside, the glass walls reflected the crimson hues of the setting sun, casting long, eerie shadows across the interior. The house was silent, unnervingly so. Every footstep echoed, bouncing off the smooth surfaces, making it feel as though something, was walking alongside us. "It's just an empty house," Satoshi muttered, running a hand along one of the cool glass panels. No spirits, no ghosts, just another urban legend. Naomi took out her recorder. Tell that to the families who ran out of here screaming. I set up my camera, panning across the living room. The reflections on the glass walls distorted slightly, shifting with the flickering light of our lanterns. But as I turned back to my colleagues, something caught my eye. My reflection was a second too slow to move. I froze. Did you see that? Naomi looked at me, then at the glass. See what? I shook my head. Never mind. We began our investigation methodically, moving from room to room. The master bedroom was minimalist in design. Just a bed, a small desk, and, of course, floor-to-ceiling glass walls that overlooked the city skyline. The view should have been breathtaking, but instead, it felt oppressive, as though something beyond the city lights was staring back at us. The first real sign of something unnatural occurred at midnight. Naomi and I had set up infrared cameras around the house, while Satoshi, still unconvinced, was lounging in the kitchen, sipping canned coffee. The atmosphere had grown noticeably colder, our breaths misting slightly despite the modern heating system. Then came the sound, light tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. We turned toward the source, eyes darting across the walls. The sound echoed from everywhere at once, as if the entire house was knocking. Naomi clutched my arm. It's coming from the glass. I stepped closer to one of the panels, shining my flashlight against it. My reflection stared back at me, only it wasn't quite right. The eyes were too dark, the mouth slightly open, as if whispering something I couldn't hear. Then, it smiled. A chilling, unnatural grin spread across the face in the glass. A grin that did not belong to me. I staggered back, colliding into Naomi. She gasped as the lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was pounding. Something wanted in, or worse, something wanted out. Satoshi shouted from the kitchen. What the hell is that? I grabbed Naomi's hand. We need to get out of here. But when we turned toward the door, our reflections didn't move. They just stood there, watching us. The reflections did not move. Naomi gripped my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. What the hell is happening? Satoshi, standing frozen in the kitchen, looked as though he had seen a ghost. That's not us. That's not us. I forced myself to breathe, my heart hammering. We need to get out. Now. But the moment I reached for the front door, the glass walls shuddered violently. The pounding sound intensified, coming from every surface around us. It was no longer rhythmic tapping, it was a desperate, frenzied assault. The reflections of ourselves standing motionless in the glass began to distort, their features stretching and twisting, their mouths opening unnaturally wide. Then, in perfect unison, they all spoke. Let us in. The voices weren't ours. They were hollow, layered, as though multiple voices overlapped. My stomach clenched in fear as the temperature in the house plummeted. Naomi screamed as one of the reflections reached out. No, not from the other side of the glass, but from within it. A pale, ghostly hand stretched through the surface as if the glass were liquid. Grasping for her wrist, Satoshi grabbed a chair and threw it at the panel. The glass shattered, but instead of falling to the ground, the shards suspended in midair like frozen raindrops, vibrating as if holding back something immense. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted towards the hallway, the floor beneath us seeming to warp and stretch. The walls pulsed, the once transparent glass now resembling black mirrors, reflecting shadows that didn't match our movements. My own reflection stared back at me, its eyes pitch black, its mouth whispering silent words I could almost understand. Then, the hallway elongated, stretching impossibly long. The front door, which had been within reach just moments ago, now seemed miles away. Naomi clutched my sleeve. "We're not going to make it." Satoshi suddenly turned left, pointing at a door. The master bedroom. I saw another exit there. With no other choice, we followed him, bursting into the bedroom. The entire back wall was made of glass, revealing the Tokyo skyline. But something was wrong. The reflection in the glass did not show the city. It showed us, not as we were, but as we could be, hollow-eyed, smiling, trapped. Behind our reflections, dark shapes lurked, whispering, waiting. Naomi backed away, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't." Then, the lights flickered and died. For a split second, everything was silent, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then a sharp, deafening crack rang through the room. The glass wall split down the middle. From within the fissures, shadowy hands reached out, stretching toward us with inhuman speed. "Go!" Satoshi shoved me forward as one of the hands nearly grabbed his shoulder. We scrambled toward the side door that led to the outside balcony. I yanked the handle. It was stuck. Behind us, the figures in the glass had begun to step forward. Their twisted, smiling faces remained locked in that horrible grin as they slowly pushed through the cracks in the wall. Desperate, I threw my entire weight against the door. It burst open, sending us tumbling onto the balcony. We didn't stop. We climbed over the railing and jumped down onto the ground floor terrace, ignoring the pain that shot through my leg upon landing. Satoshi pulled Naomi up. "Keep running." We bolted through the yard, the reflection-filled windows of the glass house watching us as we fled. The moment we passed through the gate and onto the street, the noise stopped. No more pounding, no more whispers, just silence. I turned around, gasping for breath. The house stood there, its walls pristine, its glass surfaces smooth and untouched. No cracks, no figures. It looked exactly as it had when we first arrived. But I knew better. Naomi clutched her head. I feel like something's still watching us." Satoshi exhaled shakily. "We need to go. Now." We left without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my reflection, not as I was, but as the thing in the glass, smiling, waiting. A week later, Naomi called me. Her voice was hollow, distant. I checked the footage. It's gone. Everything. It's like we were never there. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because as she spoke, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror across the room. And for just a moment, only a fleeting second, my reflection did not blink when I did. House of Seven Shadows, the Cursed Manor. Deep within the dense rainforest of the Amazon, Hidden beneath layers of mist and tangled vines, stood an estate long abandoned by time. The locals refused to speak of it, whispering only one name in fearful reverence: Casa das Sete Sombras. The House of Seven Shadows. Legend spoke of a wealthy Portuguese merchant, Dom Ignacio Ferreira, who had built the house centuries ago. His riches were vast, but his heart was blackened by greed. They said he made a pact with something unspeakable, and in return, 7 shadows came to live within his home. Each shadow, it was said, represented a soul lost to his hunger for wealth and power. I had heard these stories before, but as a historian specializing in lost estates, I dismissed them as mere folklore. That was until an old letter surfaced, written by Don Ignacio himself, pleading for salvation from the entities that had overtaken his home. The document had never been seen before, and my curiosity burned. So, I set out on a journey into the heart of the jungle, accompanied by my guide, Raphael, and my friend Isabella, a journalist who thrived on unraveling mysteries. The trek to the manor was treacherous, but after 2 days, we arrived at the edge of a forgotten world. The house loomed before us, its once grand facade now rotting beneath creeping ivy and rain-soaked decay. The massive doors creaked open as though welcoming us, revealing a hollow void of darkness beyond. Isabella exhaled. "This place is waiting." Raphael shuddered. "The elders say the shadows watch from the moment you enter." I scoffed at his superstition. But as we stepped inside, a chill ran through me. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like unseen fingers. Dust-coated chandeliers hung above, swaying slightly despite the stillness of the air. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally as we explored the manor. The grand hall stretched infinitely in all directions, its architecture warped by time and something far older. A massive portrait of Don Ignacio hung at the far end, his eyes seeming to follow us wherever we moved. Then, Raphael gasped, "Look, there!" In the dim light, shadows gathered in the corners of the room, shadows that did not belong to us. A low whisper curled through the air, a voice neither man nor beast. "You should not have come." The house groaned, the walls seeming to breathe, as if the shadows had awakened from their long slumber. The candlelight flickered violently, stretching our shadows unnaturally long across the floor. And then, the door behind us slammed shut. We were not alone. The door had slammed shut behind us, sealing us inside the suffocating darkness of Casa das Sete Sombras. The air thickened, oppressive and foul, carrying the unmistakable scent of decay. Shadows shifted along the walls, moving with a will of their own. Isabella clutched my arm. "Tell me you saw that." I nodded, my pulse hammering in my ears. Raphael, usually composed, was gripping his flashlight like a weapon. We shouldn't have come here. But we were already inside. The house had claimed us. I forced myself to focus. We need to keep moving. There has to be a way out. We crept forward, the grand hall stretching before us like an endless abyss. The massive portrait of Don Ignacio still loomed, his cold eyes following our every step. Then, something changed. The air rippled, as though the house itself had taken a breath. And then, we heard it, a whisper, ancient and hungry, 7 souls, 7 shadows. The voice slithered through the walls, not spoken aloud but pressing into our minds. Raphael jerked his head around, his face pale. Who said that? The answer came not in words, but in movement. The shadows pooled together, swirling like ink in water, forming vague humanoid shapes. Their faces were indistinct, but their intent was clear. They were watching us. Isabella gasped as one of them moved. Not walking, gliding. It passed through an antique chair as if it were smoke, its form flickering in and out of existence. We need to get upstairs. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the grand staircase, Raphael close behind. As we climbed, the whispers grew louder, overlapping voices in different languages, different eras, pleading, warning, cursing. When we reached the second floor, the shadows had multiplied. 7 figures stood in the corridor ahead, blocking our path. Their forms flickered like dying candlelight, but their presence was suffocatingly real. Raphael made the mistake of looking one directly in the face. His body stiffened, and his flashlight clattered to the floor. His breathing turned ragged as his pupils dilated, his mouth trembling as though trying to form words. Raphael. Isabella shook him, panic rising in her voice. But Raphael wasn't there anymore. He stood motionless, his gaze locked onto the shadow before him. Then, as if his strings had been cut, he collapsed. The air pulsed. The temperature dropped even further. One of the shadows laughed. I lunged for Raphael, shaking him. Wake up! Wake up! His eyes flickered. Then, in a voice that was not his own, he whispered, "One has been claimed. 6 remain." My blood ran cold. I dragged Raphael up, half carrying him toward a nearby doorway. Isabella threw it open, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The room was eerily untouched by time. A massive 4-poster bed stood in the center, its sheets pristine despite decades of abandonment. A silver mirror leaned against the far wall, its glass shimmering unnaturally. Raphael stirred, clutching his head. "What happened to me?" Isabella's voice shook. "They took you, Raphael. Something inside you." His hands trembled. I felt something pulling me, dragging me into the dark. I saw them. Their faces, their hunger. I turned toward the mirror. This house isn't just haunted. It's a prison. Isabella frowned. A prison for what? For them. For the shadows. I hesitated, dread settling into my bones. And we just became part of their game. The door behind us rattled. The whispers returned, more insistent. Isabella, Raphael, Daniel. They were saying our names now. Raphael backed away. How do they know? The mirror rippled. We turned as one, watching in horror as the reflection in the glass shifted. Our own images melted away, replaced by 7 figures standing in the shadows behind us. Then, one stepped forward. Don Ignacio. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes hollow, his mouth forming silent words. The whispers in the room surged, as if the house itself was desperate for us to hear them. Then the words became clear. "You must take our place." A force slammed into us, knocking us backward. The candles lining the walls flared, casting long, grotesque shadows. The room tilted. Or was it the house itself moving? Isabella screamed as the door flew open. The corridor beyond had changed. No longer decayed, no longer abandoned. It was alive, pulsing with energy. The walls breathed. The chandeliers above flickered as unseen figures passed beneath them. We were in the past. I staggered to my feet. We need to move. We bolted through the corridor, running past shadowy figures dressed in 18th century garments. They turned toward us, their faces blurred, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. The house was collapsing, or maybe it was being reborn. We ran past the grand hall, past Don Ignacio's cursed portrait, except now it was a mirror, a perfect reflection of the room. I skidded to a halt. The mirror, it's the only way. Raphael didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed Isabella's hand and dove forward. I followed, hurling myself into the glass. Everything inverted. A freezing sensation shot through me. For a moment, I was weightless, suspended between worlds. Then we hit the floor. The house was gone. We lay in the overgrown ruins, gasping for breath. The mist had lifted. The jungle had reclaimed Casa dos Sete Sombras. But something was wrong. Raphael's face was pale. He looked at his hands, then at the sky. "Do you hear that?" I didn't. I heard nothing. But then I saw his shadow. It was too long, too distorted, and as the moonlight hit Isabella's face, her shadow, too, began to change. A deep, inhuman whisper echoed around us. "One has escaped. Two remain." The House of Seven Shadows had not let us go. It had simply taken something in return.